All right, we will just give it another second to let people finish logging into Zoom or YouTube. Line that up just a little bit more precisely. I will just take a couple minutes here before we get down to work to wish everybody that is local here in Florida good luck again, as we are also facing a tropical storm coming in. Hopefully this will be far less disruptive than Hurricane Ian, but depending upon how much water you still have in your area, the renewed rains could still be problematic. So I hope that everybody will avoid the worst of it, stay safe, and keep dry and keep your power on. As a reminder, I'll keep broadcasting for tonight's Mishnah class as long as I've got power, and I'm sure that we'll be all just fine by next week. So there's no real concern about whether or not we'll have class then. It should go on as usual. Long term, I will remind you, as is normal, we do not have class on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, but we still have another bit of time before that. All right, I think we've got our logins in place. So let's go ahead and get down to the work at hand, which is Vayera. We are in a new Torah portion. Chapter 18 is where we're going to be focusing today, which has a very famous opening sign with Abraham and Sarah sitting in the tent and greeting some visitors who turn out to be malachim. And that is where, and they get the announcement that Sarah is going to have Yitzchak, going to have Isaac, and that is where we then transition. We transition, as we see here in verse 16, with three of the men, it's a little unclear, rising and leaving and heading down towards Sodom, and a conversation breaks out between Avraham and God. And it is incredibly powerful and incredibly instructive on the nature of justice. Tzedek is a huge topic in Jewish thought and Jewish belief, and it is very telling that this is one of the most extensive primary lessons on the concept of justice that we receive in conversation form, as opposed to the commandment form that we receive later on in the Torah. So let's go ahead, picking up here in Bereshit 18, starting with verse 16. The men arose from there and looked down upon the face of Sodom, and Avram went with them to escort them. As is often repeated in Jewish tradition, Levaya, the act of escorting someone, walking with them, especially a guest, as a sign of hospitality for leave-taking, is very, very common and powerful as a way of showing that you not only wish they could stay longer, but that you are willing to go further out of your way to help them, to protect them, to guide them as they move to the next stage of their journey. Those that go down to Sodom and Gomorrah are going to be the two that are encountered by Lot and his family, but that is a different story than the one we want to focus on today. Now, Adonai had said to himself, or had just said, the to himself is implied by the text, since we have not heard him say it to anyone else prior to this, and because of the verb order, the past perfect had said is the most appropriate translation. Shall I cover up from Avraham what I am about to do? All right, so this is rather stark. Although we have heard that Sodom and Gomorrah are not a great place when Lot chose to go down and live there last week, we haven't heard exactly what Adonai is planning for a response to that. But that aside, the shocking portion of this particular verse is that it seems that God feels that there is some reason, obligation, compelling argument to be made for needing to talk to Avraham about this, and that a failure to do so would be like a cover-up, would be almost hiding in some respect. And that is indicated in this verse as being inappropriate. What a concept that God would feel it necessary to share something with Avraham rather than do it anyway. God may be God, but God clearly has an agenda here in the conversation with Avraham, and one that we will need to discuss to uncover why this is taking place in this way. For Avraham is to become, yes, become a great nation and mighty, implication in number, as has been talked before when Avraham was had all the stars indicated to him as the number of his people, and all the nations of the earth will find blessing through him. Again, something we have heard before. Indeed, I have known him in order that he may charge his sons and his household after him. They shall keep the way of Adonai to do what is right and just, in order that Adonai may bring up Avraham what he spoke concerning him. All right. Complicated sentence in both the English and the Hebrew of exactly what is the knowing that is taking place here, and why does that then imply a commandedness to the descendants of Abraham along with him himself, and what does it mean that this then is about tzedakah umishpat, about justice and right action, or right action and justice, depending upon your translations of those. Why does that then necessitate that God needs to bring this to Abraham? Why does that force a conversation? So that is what should be swirling through you as you read these passages, even if they are familiar to you, or perhaps especially if they are familiar to you. Take a moment to recognize the radical and unsettling nature of this conversation and what it is implying about the relationship. And having now decided that it must be shared, God shares. So Adonai said, the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah, how great it is, ki rabbah, and their sin, how exceedingly heavy it weighs. So this is now God talking to Abraham, and he is beginning by pointing out that Sodom and Gomorrah seem to have a huge outcry, this zakat Sodom, right? This pouring out, this crying out. This is not exactly a lament, but a plea or a shout of distress. Outcry is a perfectly good English word. And their sin, how exceedingly heavy it weighs. So this outcry is great, rabbah, and the sin is kavda. It is also very heavy. So it's a beautiful bit of poetry here. So he has introduced that as the topic to Avraham, and then continues. Now let me go down and see if they have done according to its cry that has come to me, destruction. And if not, I wish to know. Right? So you could read that as being whether they have or haven't done as bad as the outcry that has come to me. In various places in the Torah, we see that God will hear an outcry of somebody, and that doesn't mean the outcry is necessarily legitimate, but it does mean that any outcry obviously gets God's attention. And God clearly would like to be able to tell whether or not this is actually what is happening or not. And so the men turned from there and went down to Sodom, but Avram still stood in the presence of Adonai. So those two, as we mentioned, go down and they continue their mission with Lot. But now Avraham and Adonai are standing together, and they are going to continue the conversation in verse 23 now, with Avraham taking the lead. Avraham came close and said, will you really sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? Perhaps there are 50 innocent within the city. Will you really sweep it away? Will you not bear with the place because of the 50 innocent that are in its midst? All right, so Avraham is disturbed by this, because his initial response is, but if you're going to destroy the city, which seems to be the implication, wouldn't that mean you were also destroying the tzaddik along with the Rasha. And Sadiq, of course, is from the same root as Tzedek, this whole notion of justice, which gets repeated throughout this entire passage. And he responds with the most powerful plea: heaven forbid for you to do a thing like this, to deal death to the innocent along with the guilty. Again, innocent here is could also be translated as righteous. The word Sadiq has a wide range of meanings. That it should come about like the innocent, like the guilty. Sort of almost a cliche phrase that the same thing happens to the bad and to the good. So the implication, of course, would be, why would you be good? If it's going to happen to you either way, then clearly your righteousness was pointless. Heaven forbid for you, right? A bookend to this whole lament that Avraham is having. The judge of all the earth, will he not do what is justice? Harkening back to our phrase of mishpat, our idea of justice, this hashofet kol haaretz, the judge of all the earth, won't you do justice? And this is a fundamental theological question and debate in religions around the world of whether or not the one that is the judge, meaning the God of whichever community is talking in their theology, whether or not that judge is bound by the rules of justice that are applicable to us humans, or whether or not any deed by God must inherently be just because it comes from God. Here we have Abraham giving voice to the feeling, I believe, that is the most common among most people, which is we people would like to believe, would like to understand God's justice in a way that makes sense to us and our notion of justice. And God's justice, true, may be beyond us, but we'd rather it weren't. We would rather believe and be able to understand what God is doing by recognizing the justness of God's decrees. That doesn't mean in the long run that we will, but Avraham is here voicing an opinion, I think, which is the majority view of the emotions of the average human being, of we would like to understand God's justice through the lens of the justice that we are bound to because of God's laws. And the part that seems problematic here in the mind of Avraham is that the innocent are going to be punished in the same way as the righteous. And that seems unfair. And since it is God meting out the punishment, it doesn't seem like it is inevitable. Certainly God could avoid punishing the innocent. Indeed, God could even forestall the punishment of everyone in order to protect the innocent, because that seems like it would be more fair. Indeed, in the average human situation, if there are two people and one of them is guilty of murder and the other is innocent of murder, but you're not sure which is which, you don't kill both of them to make sure you got the murderer. You allow both of them to go free to make sure you don't kill the innocent person. That is a fundamental practice in justice in most cultures and communities, even if historically they haven't always been as good at as applying it as they should have been. We wouldn't want to just say, well, better to kill 10 and get the murderer than to save 9 and let the murderer go free. That is not an average position. So Avraham is very much speaking from the heart of a general human position. All right, now it gets into a very, very famous back and forth debate between Avraham and God. Well, I wouldn't say debate. Avraham continues to haggle and bargain in a way that he doesn't, I will point out, when it comes to buying the cave of Machpelah, the burial place for Sarah, where he pays the first price mentioned. But here, where it's important, because money is not as important as human lives, Abraham is willing to argue all the way down to if there are but 10 innocent people in the town, would you not spare it? And that is where we leave the argument. Eventually we find out there aren't, and the cities are not spared. But that's not the point of this exchange. The point of this exchange is to see the discussion of justice and the back and forth between Avraham and God. Okay, before we get to our commentary about that, are there any questions on the text that are not precisely about the justice? If you have commentary as well, feel free to either unmute or to share that in the chat. just give a second for the YouTube section to catch up. Because I know YouTube is a little bit behind. And if you're on YouTube and you want to chat, throw it into the chat box. That's perfectly fine, even if it's running a little late. Okay, so let's start off with what exactly is the problem with Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, I've talked about this in greater detail in other classes, but I want to bring at least a hint of their problems, of why God is so upset, because people continue to misuse the term of Sodom and Gomorrah, or Sodom and Gomorrah, in ways that are not actually how our tradition understands. And our tradition is, of course, based upon the behavior of the people that we do actually see in the Torah, which is how they abuse or try to abuse those that came as guests to the city. So there are many, many teachings in this section of the Talmud, Sanhedrin 109b, but this is one that happens to focus on the language of our text, so I felt it was representative for today. There was a young woman who would take bread out to the poor people in a pitcher. Now, why was she taking it out hidden in a jug? So the people of Sodom would not see it. The matter was revealed, she got caught, and they smeared her with honey and positioned her on the wall of the city, and the hornets came and consumed her. So they murder her because she was taking care of the poor. And they do so in a horrible, public, and terrible manner. And that is the meaning of that which is written. And the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, Rabbah. And Rav Yehuda said, Rav says, Rabbah is an allusion to the matter of the young woman, Riva, as giving it a twist on the meaning of the word, who was killed for her act of kindness. So it was a cry because of Riva, would be a way of rereading Genesis 18:20 in light of that interpretation. And that is that this was the straw that broke the camel's back. This was the final matter that God said, look, if you are going to murder people for helping the poor, then I need to come down and put a stop to this. So the other tales of Sodom and Gomorrah involve petty theft, along with other acts of inhospitality. There is nothing truly of a sexual nature, despite the way that that word has become used in English. The sexual violence that was threatened in the story wasn't about the sex. It was about the exploitation and degradation of a guest. And it's not what is usually understood in many of the other non-Jewish teachings. But that's not the only explanation for the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah. As Rabbi Tronk of Kutno, a more recent teacher from Eastern Europe, put it, shouldn't the Torah state the cry of the oppressed in Sodom and Gomorrah is great? As after all, our verse says just the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great. Why doesn't it say the cry of the oppressed? Where is the victim in this outcry? The answer is that in most cases, it is the swindler and the robber who cries out the loudest, claiming he has been cheated or robbed. So Rabbi Tronk was clearly a great observer of human nature. It is often the person that is doing the crime against another that cries out the loudest as though they were the victim. Claiming the mantle of victimhood is an ancient tradition among those that are terrible people, because they use it as an excuse for their own terrible behavior, and because it then muddies the water of who is deserving of sympathy, and that prevents people from allying with those that are oppressed. Unfortunately, this trend does continue to the modern day, and although we are not as bad as Sodom and Gomorrah, it is still very often that every accusation is a confession, as the modern phrase puts it, that many of the people who do the worst will claim that they are the ones who are most being hurt by. So, now that we know that bad things were going on, what happens? I will descend now, says God. This teaches judges that they should not decide a capital punishment case unless they see it, meaning that there needs to be a proper trial. There needs to be proper witnesses, and there needs to be a proper conduct of the judges to make sure the trial is correct. That specifically in Sodom and Gomorrah, where capital punishment is going to be the ultimate result, God is not going down because God is unable to tell whether they deserve it or not, but because this way, when we read the Torah, we will understand that God is teaching us, human beings, that when we need to judge such a weighty matter, we too will need to go down. We will need to actually see it. We need more evidence before we can jump to a conclusion. That we should not rush to condemn somebody and head them out as part of a mob, or God forbid, to an extrajudicial murder, such as lynching or the other forms of murder that were common in our own country. But instead, a person should be arrested. They should be held for trial. Should be given a fair trial. And then, yes, if there is need, then capital punishment would be appropriate. But definitely we should avoid always rushing to judgment. God is deliberately acting like he is going down, when God, of course, has no place to descend from, and no place to go up, and no body to go, and no eyes to see, but doing this entirely for our benefit, to teach us how to behave in our cases of justice. But we are still left with what I consider the most important part of this entire section, which is, why involve Avraham at all? Fine, there was a cry from the cities. Fine, God needs to go down to see what is going on, which is telling us that we need to do the same for justice. But why drag Avraham into this conversation? Why not just get on with it? Surely the Torah can narrate about God's actions without involving the extra character of Avraham. Well, there are a few different explanations, and all of them very worthy, and all of them very insightful. The first is from Rashbam in a very practical way. God reasoned that, seeing that Avraham was sure to tell his descendants of God's promise to give him the whole land of Canaan to his descendants, he would diminish these descendants' inheritance by utterly destroying these towns and the valley, which were part of the area promised to the Jewish people as an inheritance. So God is saying, well, I'm about to go down and wipe out these areas, but I did sort of promise these to Avraham, and Avraham's going to mention it to his descendants, and his descendants are going to wonder, well, why did God promise us a piece of land and then blow it up? He therefore felt duty-bound to obtain Avraham's consent of what he was about to do. We had learned that in Genesis 10:19 that the boundaries of the Canaanite extended to regions that included the Jordan Valley. God considered it inappropriate to deny Avraham fulfillment of part of his promise by making these parts of the land of Canaan totally useless to its inhabitants. So it's a very practical thing. God gave the land to Avraham, and even though he may not have taken possession of it, eventually his descendants will, and his descendants may be a little miffed if they find out that God blew up part of their inheritance. This way, God will say, I negotiated with Avraham, and in the end, he agreed that this was the right thing to do. Therefore, you, his inheritors, have no grounds for complaint about what was done to the land. Makes sense. Not the only way to read that particular part, though. We can also look at it not just about the usability of the land, but instead, as Rashi points out, tell him what I am doing. It would be improper for me to do this thing without his knowledge. I gave him this land, so far so similar, and these 5 cities are his, 10:19. I called him Abraham, the father of a multitude of nations. Now can I destroy the sons without informing the father who loves me? All right, so Rashi says, indeed, this is still part and parcel of the covenant issue that Rashbam raised, although chronologically, yes, Rashi came first. But the issue is not so much of the descendants of Abraham being upset with the destruction of the cities, but with Abraham being upset with the destruction of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, because indeed he is supposed to be the father of a multitude of nations. Does he not now, as the inheritor of this land, count as the father of these people? Now, that changes the dynamic radically, because it is putting Abraham in a position where he is now arguing for his children, his people. Yes, they may not recognize him as their king, and he may not have taken control of the land, and no one else except him and Lot may actually think he has any right to it. But Abraham himself believes God's promise, and God's promise is this land is his. Therefore, those people are his people. They are his subjects, whether they recognize it or not. And that means he has an obligation to care for them. And that means that God has an obligation to talk with him before doing something terrible to the people that Abraham cares about. And that is an incredibly powerful lesson, that even when executing justice against the worst of the worst, we still have to care about them as people. And as we care about them as people, the justice has to be carried out with great care and great precision to ensure that only those truly deserving of a particular punishment receive that punishment. That anyone should care about the execution of justice, for this is the fulfillment of God's covenant with Abraham. We can't just say, they're bad, so of course Abraham wouldn't care about them. Even if Abraham knows they are bad, and notice he is not disputing the idea that they are bad cities, nonetheless he still cares about how they are handled. And finally, one more midrashic interpretation of why Abraham would care so much at this point. Why did the Holy One give a revelation to Abraham, meaning at this point? Rabbi Yehuda the Levite spoke of a parable. To what is this matter comparable? To a king who had an orchard and gave it to his friend as a gift. Again, paralleling God giving the land to Abraham. After some days, the king needed to cut down beams from it. Now, the king has the right to take whatever he wants from the land. The king in most of the ancient world was always given the right of eminent domain. But the king said, although it was mine, I gave it to my friend. I shall not cut them until I consult with my friend. He wants permission. He probably would have the right as king to take what he wanted, but since he has given them to his friend, he needs permission. So the Holy One, meaning this is comparable to what God did with Abraham. When he brought Abraham up into the land of Israel, he said to him, please lift up your eyes and look toward the sea and towards the north. And it is also written, and all the land which you see, to you will I give it, and to your seed forever. And I apologize for the miscapitalizations there. When therefore the Holy One wanted to destroy these 5 cities, the cities of the plain, he said, I will not destroy them without Abraham knowing. He did not therefore destroy them until he had consulted with Abraham as stated. Then the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? So the implication here is similar to as we saw, that God does not want to destroy land that had been given to Abraham, even if God had the right. Instead, he needs to consult with Abraham first. Now, all of those are very practical and very Brit focused, meaning the covenant between God and Abraham's descendants. Clearly, this is a excellent reason why God would need to discuss. But we notice from Abraham's response that Abraham doesn't take it as being just a courtesy that God is giving him regarding some property. That instead, Abraham takes it as an issue of justice, as an issue of what is right and what is wrong, and he responds accordingly. That explains then why Da'at Zekenim gives us a different interpretation of why God wants to talk to Abraham, one that focuses more on justice and righteousness than the covenant or the inheritance. Unless his descendants were to practice justice and righteousness, they would not inherit that land. So here we see that it is not so much of a courtesy call as a lesson, as a warning, that God is not just informing him of the destruction of some property, but God is informing him that that is a consequence of a lack of justice and righteousness, and that rule will continue for the descendants of Abraham as well. That the land is not coming free of condition. The land is coming with the condition that the descendants of Abraham practice justice and righteousness. And if they don't, then they will not inherit the land. that they will lose their stake in the land for some time. Unfortunately, of course, which did happen. And that transforms this as being more of a lesson, more of a warning, that it is not merely God trying to consult, but instead it is God truly instructing. As always, of course, God doesn't need the interaction with Abraham. God is capable of making up God's own mind, but Abraham needs to be made aware of this, as well as the intricacies of justice, which is why God was surely pleased when Abraham responded in the way he did. Now, how did he respond? Well, we continue with Rashi. We find the verb to come near, vayigash, used in the sense of coming near to wage war, which we find in 2 Samuel. So Joab drew near unto the battle, same verb. Of coming near to persuade by entreaty, which is in Genesis 44:18, where and Yehuda came near to him and said, "O my Lord," when he is pleading on behalf of Benjamin. Again, vayigash is the verb. And of coming near to pray, from 1 Kings 18. And Elijah the prophet came near and said, "O Lord, God of Abraham," which of course has the added benefit of mentioning Abraham. But again, vayigash, that verb is used in that as well. So there are three different ways this verb can be used. If you are coming into battle, if you are coming to make a plea, if you are coming forward to pray. Abraham, says the Midrash, employed all these methods. We don't have to argue about which one he was using this, which sense of this word he was using. He was using all of them. To fight by speaking stern words, because Abraham is a little chutzpahdik, he is a little audacious in his discussion with God, and to persuade by entreaty, he does seem to be begging on behalf of the people there, and to pray. He is also just praying to God to not only change his mind or to act justly, but to do so in a way that he will understand. So we can see that Abraham's participation in this discussion is an incredibly powerful and significant benchmark in how we are to engage. Whenever there is a question of justice at hand, vayigash is our watchword. We come forward to do battle on the side of justice. We come forward to plead on the side of justice, and we come forward in order to pray for justice as well. That all three actions are always necessary anytime justice is the goal. But we need to get more into the meat of exactly what was it about this act that was causing Abraham to have concern. So let's look at a couple commentaries from Sforno and others to unravel that. Abraham felt that the way God had worded the decree with the word "for it is great," that what God might have meant was that as long as the majority of the people were guilty, this would justify eliminating the entire city, including the innocent. In that event, God would not be perceived as meting out justice. So going back again for that phrase that it is rabbah, that it is great, rabbah can also just mean rov, meaning the majority. And that might have been what Abraham thought God meant. The cry of Sodom and Gomorrah has come out, and it is the majority, meaning 50.1% of the people are terrible. Therefore, I'm going to destroy the entire city. And Abraham, misunderstanding God's intent, but thinking that might be the implication, immediately objects. How could you do that? How could you destroy an entire city just because 50.1% of the people in the city were wicked? Surely that 49.9% of the people that are innocent do not deserve to be swept away along with that majority of people that are. That would not be justice. Now, again, we can debate all we wish of whether or not it would be just or unjust for God to do it, but Abraham is adamant that it would not be just according to the rules of justice that God has given for the world, and that it is necessary for the people of the world to perceive God's actions as just as well. Indeed, that may be one of the reasons why God has said that he would never destroy the entire world in order to avoid such claims. Indeed, there are other midrashim that say that Abraham was confused about that, but we'll talk about those in a little bit. Seeing that you are the judge of the whole earth, if you will judge people based on the conduct of the majority, you would eventually be forced to destroy mankind, seeing that most people everywhere are wicked, at least in the opinion of Abraham at that time. So here Sforno finishes off the problem. It is not just that the innocent will be destroyed in Sodom and Gomorrah, but if you are going to apply the rule of justice as following the majority, then why would you stop at the city? If the majority of the people in a country are evil, would you destroy the whole country? If the majority of the people in the world are evil, would you destroy all of mankind? Obviously, Abraham feels that would be unjust, and he also feels that would be likely, meaning that yes, at any given time, the majority of the people have done slightly more bad than good, and thus, at any given time, the world is deserving of destruction. Clearly, we don't want God to do that. We want God to err on the side of patience and compassion, and thus it would be unjust for that to take place. Now, you may notice that there is a subtle shift that is happening as we look into Abraham's reasonings for having this argument. It is not that the innocent, not that the wicked are not deserving of justice. It is that the innocent are deserving of justice too. And justice for them would be that they would be spared. However, the subtle shift that Abraham is making that is truly outstanding is by the fact that it is only just for the innocent to be spared, he is also extending an umbrella of compassion, of patience, of mercy to the wicked who do not deserve that. That because God does not want to destroy the innocent, according to Abraham's opinion, so too the wicked will be able to enjoy a bit of a respite from the hand of judgment because of the umbrella that is extended because of the justice needed for the innocent. So mercy and compassion are not always given just for the wicked themselves. Sometimes it is a byproduct of the justice for the innocent. Something very careful something that we need to be very careful about whenever thinking about justice is how will it affect the innocent? And that, yes, sometimes bringing justice to the innocent is more important than bringing immediate harsh justice to the wicked. And that will sometimes mean that the wicked will enjoy mercy and compassion that they themselves may not have earned. And the Lord went away, meaning at the end of this conversation, God departs, which is an unusual phrase. As soon as the counsel for the defense had nothing more to say, the judge took his departure, meaning that God then is saying, well, if that's your final argument, 10 people, and if not 10 people, then the city gets destroyed. If that's your final claim, then I guess we're done because there aren't 10 people. Meaning that Abraham had continued the trial going on and on and on until he reached that point. And it was only when he chose to be silent that God decided that I guess the decision is made and the arguments are finished. As Siftei Chachamim, the super commentary on Rashi, points out, the verse comes to teach us that God seeks out the defender's words because he does not desire death for the wicked. But when the defender fell silent, he left. Otherwise, why does it say here, he departed, unlike all other prophecies where this is not mentioned? Signaling in on that phrase, he departed, Siftei Chachamim is saying, what Rashi is trying to tell us is that God cherishes the words of the defender. He cherishes that defense counsel. He wants to hear more reasons, more explanations of why destroying the wicked is not appropriate at this time. But when the defenders fall silent, then God recognizes that they no longer have any interest, willingness, or justification for sparing them from punishment at this time. Again, it means that we should exhaust all of our efforts and resources to try and prevent the destruction of those who have done wrong, and instead look for ways that we can redeem and help them. In the end, yes, there may come a time when justice is the inevitable conclusion, but that should always be at the end, whereas we should try to save them first. And we're going to finish off with just a couple other teachings about this whole concept of justice. Or HaChaim brings back that idea of the flood itself. God decided to take Abraham into his confidence. The reason God decided to take Abraham into his confidence was because Abraham entertained doubts about the justice of God having brought on the deluge. Indeed, I hear people continue to this day saying that they feel the idea of the flood is simply immoral, that could not be done by a just God. And it wouldn't be surprising that a man of Abraham's moral character would feel that way. After all, he would have seen despots and tyrants of his own time, even just local bandit lords, attack and burn cities to the ground. He had already fought in one such war trying to defend his nephew, and he would have been aware of many other examples. So if those attackers and despots are immoral because they burn cities to the ground, doesn't that make it feel like God would be immoral doing the same? He found it impossible to believe, Abraham found it impossible to believe that there had not been at least 10 or 20 righteous people at that time, meaning of the flood. It never occurred to him that the world could be that corrupt. Indeed, for many of the righteous people of the world, it is hard for them to understand that there are many people that are not that nice. In his opinion, God should have suspended judgment on their account, meaning not destroyed the world because those 10 or 20 people must have been wiped away by the flood, and that seems wrong. The words, "as I do," mean I do not destroy a nation unless there are no righteous people. Meaning, if we go back, this is something we need to look at in its midst, when we see that, lost my place. Yeah, there we are. We go back, we see Asher Ani Oseh. Oseh is in the, well, in modern terms would be called the present tense form, a little more complicated grammatically, meaning that this is not just what I will do, as the translation tries to render it, but instead could be rendered as what I do, meaning generally, that routinely, I don't destroy unless there are zero people that are actually, unless there are no people that are wicked. Unless everybody is wicked, that's a better way of putting it, I don't destroy. That's not my nature. When I destroyed at the flood, it's hard to believe, I know, but yes, everybody except the people on that boat were deserving of destruction. When I go to Sodom and Gomorrah, I know it's hard to believe, but yes, everybody was worthy of destruction. Doesn't happen often, but it can happen. And don't feel that that is unjust. Now, we're going to finish with just one last insight, this time by Ramban, of a subtlety of the entire text, and one that, when reflected upon, I think, summarizes everything that is going on in this discussion. Throughout the dialogue, God is referred to by the tetragrammaton, meaning the Yud He Vav He. You will note that we repeatedly use the term Adonai for the Yud He Vav He that is found throughout the discussion. But addressed, meaning as Adonai, by Abraham. When Abraham's actually talking to God, when Abraham approaches him, for example, just a second, there we are. He does not approach him and say Adonai. He doesn't address him as Adonai. Instead, and I seem to have forgotten where my verse was. He instead and directs him as El Adonai, not the Yud He Vav He that we pronounce as Adonai, but the actual word Adonai, meaning my Lord or my master. Now, why is that significant? That God is referred to by the narrator as Yud He Vav He, the tetragrammaton, but referred to by Abraham in quotes as Adonai, meaning my master, my Lord. The tetragrammaton is linked to God's mercy, and Adonai is linked to God's aspect of justice. So what is actually happening here is Abraham feels like God is acting as a strict judge, as Adonai, the actual word Adonai, the judgment aspect of God's nature. But the narrator, to which we, the reader, are privy, is clearly referring to God as the Yud He Vav He, which is God's aspect of mercy. It may appear from Abraham's view that God is being a harsh and maybe even cruel judge, but in reality, behind what Abraham can perceive from his point of view, God is actually acting with mercy. God is trying to be as merciful as is possible. And unfortunately, the destruction of the cities is still going to take place. But that's not because God is being a strict judge, but only because God has been merciful up till this point. It is often hard for us to perceive God's mercy. It is sometimes easier for us to imagine that it is harsh and cruel judgment. But we need to recognize that sometimes things are not as we take them to be. On the contrary, for our own behavior, sometimes we may wish to be harsh and perhaps even cruel judges of others around us, but we should instead follow God's pattern and try to be as merciful and compassionate as possible while still maintaining a safe and secure community. But beginning with the concepts of compassion and mercy that God has extended to all of God's world. It's not easy. As humans, we are not as gifted with the capacity for compassion as God is, but we are certainly capable of doing more than we usually do at our first emotional reaction. And that's always the good benchmark. If you are feeling angry and emotional, then whatever it is that you are imagining should be done is not going to be justice. That will be vengeance and anger. And that right there should tell you to stop, seek that aspect of mercy and compassion to guide you, and allow that to be your first response, and lean towards justice only at the end when absolutely necessary as a last resort. All right, well, that will take us through to the end of our discussion today. I'll pause for a moment to see if anyone has any questions on the rest of this section of the Torah or from our commentaries. Just give a minute for YouTube to catch up, because I know there is a time lag. And a second for anyone who might be formulating their ideas to either put them down in the chat or to unmute and share them. All right, well, having seen none and knowing that many people are preparing their properties for the tropical storm blowing in, we will call it a day here. Continue your study, and I hope to see you tonight for Mishnah. We are starting a new Masechet of Beitzah, and if I don't see you there, then hopefully I'll see you for Shabbat.